The rust wasn't just on the iron chains, it had seeped into the very soul of Red Hollow. They chained her to the church fence as the sun bled out across the horizon, a perverse sacrament for the town's pious eyes. Her name was Eliza, and the splintered wood of the fence post bit into her back, a cruel mockery of the cross that loomed above the church doors. They'd ripped her bonnet from her head, letting her auburn hair, now matted with dust and sweat, become a banner for her supposed shame. She did not cry. Not when Deacon Hart's wife, a woman whose hands were as soft as her heart was hard, slapped her with a flash of righteous fury. Not when Sheriff Miller, a man who once bounced her on his knee, deliberately turned his hollow gaze away. And not even when a glob of spit landed inches from her bare feet, a final, ugly seal on her condemnation. "Let this be a warning," the deacon boomed, his voice a hammer of judgment. "A woman who tempts a married man will face the Lord with her sins exposed." But there was no sin. There was only bread delivered to a pastor's door. There was only a kind word. In Red Hollow, that was more than enough. Part 1. The altar of shame. The air in Red Hollow was thin, not from the mountain altitude, but from a profound lack of charity. It was a town carved from rock and rigid righteousness, a place where whispers were currency and reputations were as fragile as spun glass. Eliza had been born into this suffocating embrace, learning its unspoken commandments from birth. Keep your head bowed, your voice hushed, and your spirit neatly folded away. But Eliza's spirit was not a thing to be folded. It was a vibrant, untamable wildflower pushing its way through cracks in the stone. And that, she was beginning to understand, was her gravest transgression. The accusation was a poisoned dart, shot from the bow of Pastor Davy's wife, a woman withered by a loveless marriage and a barren life. Mrs. Davies had witnessed Eliza sharing a brief, innocent exchange with the pastor on his porch, a simple inquiry about a sick child in the parish. But in the barren landscape of the woman's imagination, she saw a conspiracy of lust. She saw a temptress, a Jezebel weaving her wicked spells around a man of God. The tale she spun was a masterpiece of bitter invention, each telling more embellished and damning than the last. By noon, the entire town had heard Eliza was seen sneaking from the pastor's private study at odd hours. By dusk, the story had morphed into a full-blown narrative of witchcraft. Her kindness was recast as cunning, her smile a sorcerous lure. No one rose to her defense. It was far easier to swallow the familiar tale of a fallen woman than to contemplate a good man's moment of weakness or, God forbid, a respected wife's venomous jealousy. The men of the town, led by Deacon Hart, a man whose public piety was matched only by the ruthlessness of his private business dealings, saw a perfect opportunity to perform their particular brand of brutal public theater. They were the self-appointed guardians of morality, and Eliza was to be their sacrifice on the altar of shame. They came for her at her small cabin at the edge of town. They dragged her out, her protests for reason swallowed by their sanctimonious shouts. Her little garden, her one sanctuary of peace with its carefully tended herbs and burgeoning wildflowers, was trampled into the mud under their heavy, righteous boots. They saw it not as a garden, but as a witch's patch, its fragrant lavender and healing chamomile suddenly sinister. Sheriff Miller, a man whose tin badge felt more like a costume than a symbol of authority, simply stood by, his hands clasped behind his back. He owed Deacon Hart a significant sum of money, a debt that now shackled his conscience as surely as the rust-eaten iron would soon shackle Eliza's wrists. He saw the raw terror in her eyes, the same wide green eyes that had once looked up at him with unblemished childhood trust as he handed her a peppermint stick at the general store. The memory was a hot coal in his gut. He turned away, the shame of his cowardice a sharper sting than any physical blow. As they bound her to the fence, The women of Red Hollow gathered at a safe distance. Their faces were a chilling tableau of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. They were the silent jury, their verdict delivered in pursed lips and sidelong glances. In Eliza, they saw not a neighbor in peril, but a terrifying reflection of their own precarious positions, a reminder of how quickly one could be cast out, deemed unclean, and stripped of all standing. By endorsing her punishment, they reinforced the brittle foundations of their own fragile security. Only Micah, the lanky, perpetually earnest boy who swept the church floors, dared to break the consensus. "She ain't done nothing wrong," he'd cried out, his voice cracking with the indignation of youth. Deacon Hart's eldest son, a brute of a man who possessed all of his father's temper and none of his cunning, strode over and backhanded Micah across the face with a grunt. "You want to join her on that fence, boy? Then keep your mouth shut." Micah stumbled back, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes locking with Eliza's in a final, fleeting moment of shared, helpless humanity. Now, as twilight bled into a starless, unforgiving night, the town retreated into the lamplit warmth of their homes. They sat down to their suppers, their bellies full of stew, their souls bloated with the satisfaction of a lesson savagely taught. The street emptied, leaving Eliza alone with the creeping cold, the unyielding iron, and the throbbing, multi-layered symphony of her pain. But beneath the agony and the humiliation, a different fire was being stoked. It was not fear that now gripped her heart. It was a white-hot, incandescent fury. A rage not for herself, but for the profound, soul-crushing injustice of it all. For every woman before her who had been silenced, shamed, and broken by men who wrote the rules and the women who enforced them. She focused on her breath, each inhale a small act of defiance, each exhale a silent curse upon them all. She waited for the darkness to bring whatever horrors it held. She would not give them the satisfaction of breaking. Part 2. A Ghost in the Gloom. The night deepened, wrapping Red Hollow in a shroud of suffocating blackness. The one lantern left hanging on a post near the church cast a weak, flickering glow, a lonely beacon in a sea of judgment. The familiar sounds of the town, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the bark of a dog, died away one by one, replaced by the hoot of a distant owl and the ceaseless, indifferent chirping of crickets. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the jeering crowd had been. It was a silence that confirmed her abandonment. Eliza's body screamed in protest. Her muscles, stretched and strained, trembled with exhaustion. She tried to shift her weight, to find a single, momentary sliver of relief, and a sharp cry escaped her lips as the iron chain bit deeper into the raw flesh of her collarbone. The metallic taste of her own blood, from a lip split by the deacon's wife, was a constant, coppery tang on her tongue. It was in this moment of absolute desolation, when she felt her spirit beginning to fray, that she heard it. It wasn't the drunken stumble of a miner heading home from the saloon, or the cautious tread of the sheriff on his half-hearted rounds. This was different. Hoofbeats. But they were impossibly quiet, slow and deliberate, the sound muffled by the thick dust of the street. It was the sound of a ghost moving through the world of the living. A silhouette detached itself from the impenetrable shadows at the edge of the pines that bordered the town. A man on horseback. He was tall and impossibly still in the saddle, his form seeming to merge with the very fabric of the night. He was not from Red Hollow. She knew every man, every horse, every slump-shouldered posture in this town. This was an outsider, a phantom. He halted his horse, a magnificent beast as dark and silent as its rider, about 20 feet from her. The man dismounted in a single, fluid motion that was utterly silent and spoke of a lifetime of such grace. He stepped into the weak, wavering circle of lantern light, and Eliza's breath hitched in her throat. He was Apache. The townsfolk would have crossed themselves, would have screamed that a demon had been summoned by her sins. They spoke of the Apache in hushed, fearful tones, calling them savages, phantoms of the wilderness. But as Eliza looked at him, she saw none of that. His face was a masterpiece of angles and weathered planes, his cheekbones high and proud, catching the faint light. Two long, dark braids, interwoven with small, unidentifiable tokens, framed a face that was etched with a history she could not begin to read. But it was his eyes that captured her, that silenced the screaming in her own mind. They were dark, profound, and utterly devoid of the contempt and cruel piety she had been drowning in for hours. They were ancient eyes, filled with a sorrow and a wisdom that seemed to echo the vast, silent land from which he came. In them, she saw a reflection of her own pain. From a sheath at his belt, he drew a curved blade. The handle was polished bone, the steel clean and sharp, catching a glint of the lantern light like a captured star. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved towards her, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He crouched beside her, and for one heart-stopping, eternal moment, he simply met her gaze. It was not a look of pity, but of recognition. A silent question passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared humanity in a place that had forgotten its meaning. Then, with a swift, powerful flick of his wrist, he brought the blade down. Not on her, but on the taut chain link just above her bindings. The iron snapped with a sharp crack that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. The chain fell away, landing in the dust with a dead thud. For the first time that day, a sob tore through Eliza's throat. It was a raw, ragged animal sound of disbelief and profound release. Her legs, numb and useless from hours of strain, gave way beneath her. Before she could collapse into the dirt, he was there, catching her. His hands were strong, sure, and impossibly gentle as they closed around her arms. He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer his. He simply lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, his arms a cradle of unexpected, staggering strength. He placed her gently onto the saddle of his horse, then swung up behind her, his body a warm, solid wall against her trembling back. One of his hands rested lightly, possessively, on her waist, a steadying, grounding presence, while the other took the reins. Her body was racked with tremors, a violent storm of shock and relief. She had spent her life surrounded by men who filled the world with their noise, boasting, barking orders, preaching sermons. Men who used words as cudgels to silence and control. This man hadn't spoken a single word, yet in his profound silence, she felt heard more deeply, more completely than she ever had in her life. As the horse turned and moved away, carrying them into the deep, welcoming embrace of the pines, the dim lights of Red Hollow flickered and died behind them. She didn't look back. She was riding away from shame, riding away from her old life, toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine, with a silent stranger who felt more like salvation than any angel she had ever been taught to pray to. Part 3. The Slow Thaw of Kindness. The world dissolved into a moving tapestry of pine, shadow, and the scent of damp earth. The horse moved with a gentle, sure-footed gait, as if the animal itself understood the fragility of its cargo. Eliza allowed herself to lean back, the exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight pressing her down. Her cheek came to rest against the hard, warm plane of the man's chest. Beneath the worn leather of his vest, she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a slow, calm, powerful cadence that became an anchor in the swirling, chaotic sea of her mind. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. It was the most comforting, most real sound she had ever heard. His presence was a living paradox. He was a complete stranger, a man the world had conditioned her to fear and revile. Yet she felt a sense of profound safety she hadn't known was possible. A quiet, potent energy radiated from him, nothing like the brutish, loud force of the men in Red Hollow. This was something wilder, more elemental, like the ancient mountains that loomed in the distance, or the silent watching stars above. And in that wildness, there was a strange and powerful pull, a nascent heat stirring in the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with the simple warmth of his body against hers. It was an awakening. They rode for hours, climbing ever higher into the hills, leaving the fetid air of the town far below. The air grew sweeter, cooler, scented with pine and the promise of rain. He navigated the treacherous, moonless darkness with an instinct that was both animal and arcane, his connection to the land palpable. Just before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft pearl gray, he guided the horse into a small, perfectly hidden clearing. A simple lean-to, expertly constructed from fallen logs and woven branches, stood nestled against the face of a large, moss-covered boulder. A stone-lined fire pit, cold and dark, sat at its center, a silent promise of warmth. With the same silent efficiency, he dismounted and then gently, carefully, helped her down. Her legs, stiff and weak, nearly buckled, but his hands were there, strong and steady, preventing her fall. He guided her to the shelter, where a thick, soft fur pelt lay spread on the packed earth. Without a word, he turned and began to build a fire. His movements were a study in economy and grace, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. He wasn't rushing. He was performing a ritual from memory, a dance of survival he had perfected over a lifetime. Eliza watched from the haven of the fur, huddled and shivering, trying to process the violent shift in her reality. The world she knew, its rules, its people, its cruelties, had been stripped away, leaving her soul raw and exposed. And into that gaping void had stepped this silent, enigmatic man. He expected nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply was. When the first flames licked the dry kindling and crackled to life, casting dancing golden shadows on the rocks, he produced 2 tin cups and a small blackened pot. He brewed something over the fire, and the fragrant, earthy aroma of herbs filled the small clearing. He handed her a cup. Her hands shook so violently that the hot liquid sloshed over the rim. He waited, his patience a tangible thing, until she had managed to take a tentative sip of the warm, soothing brew. Then, he sat across the fire from her, not beside her. He gave her space, a gift she hadn't realized she so desperately needed. He stared into the flames, his profile sharply carved by the firelight, as if waiting for the fire itself to speak first. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was filled with the weight of the night they had just passed through, with 1,000 unspoken questions. Why? The word was a dry croak, torn from her raw throat. It sounded thin and fragile in the vast, breathing wilderness. Why did you help me? For a long, contemplative moment, he did not look at her. He reached into a worn leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small, folded piece of oiled cloth. It was stained and creased from years of handling, but clearly cherished. He unfolded it with a reverence that was almost painful to watch. Inside lay a small, tarnished, leather-bound locket. He opened it, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the delicate, intricate sketch of a woman's face. The artist had captured her spirit perfectly, and in her eyes, Eliza saw the same deep, haunting wound she saw in her own reflection in the stream. A sorrow too deep for tears. "Your wife?" she whispered, the question an intrusion she couldn't hold back, a desperate need to understand this man's own story of pain. He gave a single, sharp, affirmative nod, his gaze still fixed on the flames. What happened to her? The silence that followed was his answer. It was a silence more profound and heavy than any words could ever be. It spoke of loss, of injustice, of a pain so foundational it had reshaped his entire world. Eliza understood. The world had stolen someone precious from him, had inflicted a wound that would never fully heal. And now, he was answering that theft not with vengeance, but with a defiant act of compassion. He was refusing to let the world steal anyone else while he stood by. He wasn't saving her to be a hero. He was honoring a silent, sacred promise to someone long gone. And for Eliza, huddled by a stranger's fire in the middle of a world she no longer recognized, that was more than enough. It was everything. Part 4. A language beyond words. The sun climbed higher, spilling liquid gold through the canopy of trees, but Eliza remained by the fire. The ashes had cooled to a soft, powdery gray, a mirror to the numbness that had settled deep in her soul. Her wrists were a painful geography of her ordeal, swollen and bruised a violent shade of purple where the chains had bitten deep. She hadn't asked to leave. He hadn't rushed her. The world outside their hidden sanctuary had ceased to exist, its clamor replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pines. Toha. He had traced the letters for her in the dirt, Toha, his finger firm and sure, giving her a name for his silence. Knelt by the small, clear stream that trickled nearby. He filled a carved wooden bowl with the cool water and set it gently beside her. Then, from his satchel, he produced another small pouch, this one of soft deerskin. He opened it to reveal a fine powder of ground herbs, its scent a potent, healing mix of pine, sage, and rich earth. He soaked a strip of clean linen in the water, dipped it into the herbal mix to form a paste, and held it out to her. His dark eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw no pity, a sentiment she had grown to despise, only a shared, solemn understanding of pain. She hesitated, her body instinctively flinching. The touch of a man was now a thing she associated with violence, pain, and violation. He seemed to read her thoughts as clearly as if she had spoken them aloud. He didn't move closer. He simply waited, his hand outstretched, an offering without pressure, a question without words. Slowly, her own hand trembling, she took the damp cloth from him. As she pressed the cool, soothing poultice to her raw skin, something inside her, a wall of ice built around her heart, cracked. It was not a crack of pain, but of release. The simple, unadorned kindness of the gesture was more overwhelming, more powerful than all the cruelty she had endured. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. As she tended to her wounds, she allowed herself to truly study him. His shoulders were broad, built for hardship. His arms were corded with muscle and lined with a tapestry of scars, the faded white lines of old battles, of a life lived hard and close to the bone. But it was his face that held her captive. The sharp, silent features were not hard or cruel. Along his high cheekbones were faded tattoos, intricate lines and symbols she didn't understand. "What do they mean?" she asked, her voice stronger now, imbued with a genuine curiosity. He touched the edge of one of the symbols with his fingertip. Then, he picked up a charred stick from the fire pit and drew a line in the dirt. It was a straight, jagged line, like a lightning strike. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "A wound?" she guessed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded once, then drew a smaller, softer, curved line across the first one. "Healed," she breathed, her heart catching in her throat. He nodded again. A whole story, a philosophy, told in two simple lines drawn in the dirt. That's when she saw it more clearly, a scar that lay beneath the faded ink on his jaw, a faint, jagged line that the tattoos couldn't quite hide, a deep cut, poorly healed. She wondered what that healing had cost him. Gathering her courage, she pointed to her own chest. "Do I have one?" she asked, meaning a wound on her soul. a scar on her spirit. He leaned forward, his presence suddenly immense, his shadow falling over her. He didn't gesture with his hand. Instead, he gently pointed a single, calloused finger, not at her heart, but higher, at the base of her throat, where her voice was born. "My voice," she whispered in dawning realization. He nodded, his eyes intense and unwavering. "It's still here," she said, the words a revelation to herself. "But no one's ever listened." For the very first time, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't a smile, not in the way she knew it. It was something rarer, something more precious. A flicker of acknowledgement, a ghost of a shared understanding that passed between them like a spark. And in that singular, transformative moment, she realized he had been listening from the very second he found her. Not just to her words, but to her silence, to the story her body told, to the untamed fury in her eyes, to the resilient beat of her heart. He had heard all of it. The realization ignited a new kind of heat inside her, a slow-burning ember of profound connection that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a wild, untamed feeling, a current of awareness flowing between them in the charged silence, a love story beginning not with a pretty word, but with a shared scar. Part 5. The Tempest and the Confession. A week bled into the next, and the clearing became Eliza's entire world, her sanctuary. Time was no longer measured by the harsh clang of the church bell or the judgmental gaze of the sun, but by a series of small, intimate rituals that wove their lives together. The way Toha would watch the star-dusted sky before sleeping, as if reading a silent scripture. The way he left a single, perfect wildflower, a purple lupine, a fiery Indian paintbrush, by her sleeping mat each morning. The way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the camp, a gaze that was at once protective and intensely possessive, a silent, smoldering heat that made her skin tingle with an awareness she had never known. The thick cloak of shame that had been her constant companion in Red Hollow began to slough off like a snake's dead skin. In its place, a new and fierce confidence took root and began to grow. She was no longer the broken woman they had twisted her into, but the woman she was always meant to be. Her laughter, when it finally came, a genuine, unbridled sound sparked by a clumsy rabbit tripping over its own feet, was a sound as wild and free as the stream that ran through their camp. It startled them both, and the look he gave her was one of wonder. The storm arrived without warning, a physical manifestation of the turmoil they had both weathered. It rolled in over the western ridge with a low, guttural howl that vibrated deep in Eliza's bones. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple gray, and the wind tore through the pines with a furious, shrieking sound that ripped at the leaves. The raw violence of it reminded her of the mob, of the night she'd been dragged from her home, her world torn asunder. But this time, she was not alone. Toha pulled her into the sturdy lean-to, his movements calm but urgent. He secured a heavy hide flap over the entrance, plunging them into a dim, intimate twilight as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The rain quickly became a deluge, a solid, driving sheet that slammed against the earth with a percussive roar. Lightning cracked, a brilliant, blinding flash that illuminated the small space for a split second. In that stark, momentary light, she saw his face, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable pools of darkness. "You afraid?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, deeper and more resonant than the thunder that now shook the ground beneath them. The old Eliza, the girl from Red Hollow, would have lied. She would have hidden her fear behind a brittle mask of propriety. But she was not that girl anymore. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady above the storm's din. "But not of the storm." He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto hers, intense and searching, demanding the truth she had been hiding even from herself. What then? The words rose from a place deep inside her, a place she hadn't dared to explore until this very moment, a truth forged in the crucible of his kindness and their shared silence. "Of this," she whispered, her hand gesturing to the small, charged space between them, a space that crackled with more energy than the lightning tearing through the sky outside. "Of staying, of wanting to stay, of what it means to feel. This, for you." Toha didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His expression softened, the hardness melting away to reveal a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. He simply reached out his hand, palm upward, and waited. It was not a demand. It was an offer, a question. And with a shuddering breath that felt like both a surrender and a victory, she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm and calloused, a map of the hard life he had lived. His fingers closed around hers with a possessive strength that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fire straight to her core. The touch was electric, a spark in the darkness that ignited a firestorm within her. The silence that fell between them was no longer just comfortable or communicative. It was sacred, charged with a wild, unspoken passion that had been building since the moment he cut her free. The thunder faded into a distant rumble, but the storm inside the shelter was just beginning. He leaned closer, his other hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the delicate line of her cheek with a tenderness that made her want to weep. His eyes burned with a raw, untamed hunger that she recognized because it was a perfect reflection of her own. "Eliza," he murmured, her name a rough, beautiful prayer on his lips. It was the first time he had spoken it aloud, and the sound of it in his voice shattered the very last of her reservations. She didn't answer with words. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as he closed the small, torturous distance between them. His lips met hers, not with the gentle reverence of his previous touches, but with a fierce, desperate passion that stole her breath. It was a kiss of lightning and thunder, of rain and earth, of two broken and lost souls finding their whole in each other. It was a kiss that tasted of sorrow and salvation, of fury and a wild, defiant love. It was the kiss of a man who had been silent for far too long, and a woman who had finally found a reason to raise her voice. In the heart of the storm, they found their calm. In the suffocating darkness, they found their light. And in the beautiful wreckage of their shared brokenness, they forged a love as wild, as untamed, and as enduring as the land that had brought them together. Part 6. Ghosts of Red Hollow. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean, glistening, and smelling of ozone and wet pine. But the storm that had broken between them had not passed. It had settled, becoming the new climate of their world, a constant, humming energy that charged every glance, every touch, every shared silence. They were no longer just two survivors sharing a space. They were partners in every sense of the word, their lives becoming as intertwined as the ancient roots of the pines that sheltered them. Their love was a quiet, powerful thing, expressed not in grand declarations, but in the steady rhythm of their life together, in the way he would bring her the first wild strawberries of the season, or the way she would mend a tear in his leather vest, her stitches small and neat. Word of Eliza's survival, and more importantly, her defiance, traveled on the wind, carried by fur trappers and itinerant merchants who passed the high ridges. The story twisted and turned with each retelling, becoming a dark legend in the saloons and sewing circles of Red Hollow. The Apache savage stole her, some said with a grim shake of their heads. "She's his captive, poor thing," whispered others with a delicious, pitying shudder. But the old, wise midwife who rode the trails claimed she heard a lullaby drifting from the woods near their ridge, a gentle song sung in two different languages, one woven around the other. The blacksmith, a man of few words, swore he saw them by the river at dawn, not as captor and captive, but as two people moving in a perfect, silent harmony that shamed the very idea of ownership. One bright, clear morning, as Eliza was tending to the small, thriving garden they had planted, a riotous celebration of beans, squash, and fragrant lavender that Toha said smelled like peace, she saw them. 3 riders, emerging from the trees like vengeful ghosts. It was Miriam, the pastor's wife, her face a mask of pinched virtue, flanked by 2 of her most devout and gossiping followers. They were draped in pride and polished boots, their mission clear. "Well, well," Miriam drawled, dismounting with a theatrical sneer that didn't quite hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "Look who survived the wilderness." Eliza rose slowly from her knees, wiping the rich, dark earth from her hands onto her buckskin tunic. The feather pendant Toha had carved for her lay against her collarbone, a silent testament to her new life. "I didn't just survive, Miriam," she said, her voice soft but carrying the clear, ringing authority of a bell. "I healed." "Healed?" another woman scoffed, her face a mask of disbelief. "Don't be absurd. He didn't steal you? He didn't hurt you?" The question was laced with a morbid, hopeful curiosity. A genuine, startling laugh escaped Eliza's lips. "Hurt me? No, Miriam. He showed me what kindness is. He taught me what respect feels like. He gave me the space to choose, something none of you in Red Hollow ever did." Just then, Toha emerged from the cabin, drawn by the voices. He moved with his customary silence, an imposing figure of quiet strength. He didn't reach for the knife at his belt. He didn't need to. His very presence was a weapon, a shield, and a declaration. He came to stand beside Eliza, not in front of her as a protector, but next to her as an equal. The sight of them together, so clearly a unit, a force of nature, seemed to unravel Miriam's carefully constructed composure. "Pastor John sent us," she stammered, her voice losing its sharp edge, faltering under their combined, unwavering gaze. "He said you might want to return. He's sorry for how things turned out." "Return?" Eliza's laugh was full and rich this time, a sound of pure freedom. "Return to what? To your chains and your silence and your bitter, suffocating judgments?" She looked from Miriam's stunned face to Toha, whose dark eyes were warm with a fierce, possessive pride. "I have found a new church, Miriam. It's built from pine and fire and the open sky." "Then you know your place," Miriam spat, a last pathetic attempt to wound, to regain control. With a savage. "Yes," Eliza said, her voice ringing with a power that silenced them all, a power born of love and self-worth. "Right here. This is my place." As if on cue, Toha reached into the small pouch at his waist and pulled out something small. It was a ring, carved from the dark, rich wood of a fallen cedar, inlaid with a single, tiny fleck of brilliant blue turquoise, the color of the sky after a storm. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply held it out to her in the palm of his calloused hand, an offering as simple and profound as his love. "Only if you want it," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her ears. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were tears of overwhelming joy, not sorrow. Her voice, when she answered, did not shake. "I do." The 3 women from Red Hollow watched, stunned into a rare and complete silence, as Eliza took the ring and slipped it onto her own finger. It was a perfect fit. There was no priest, no sermon, no congregation. Just the wind in the pines as their witness, and a truth so powerful, so self-evident, it needed no validation from the outside world. Miriam and her companions, defeated, turned and rode away, their rigid righteousness shattered against the unyielding rock of a love they could never, ever comprehend. Eliza turned to Toha, her heart so full it felt like it might burst from her chest. "Did you plan that?" A rare, slow, breathtaking smile touched his lips, transforming his face. "No, but I knew they would come. Old ghosts always circle back to see if you are still afraid of them." She leaned into him, pressing her face against the solid warmth of his chest, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and pine and home. "Well, let them watch," she whispered, her voice fierce and sure. "I'm not afraid of anything anymore." That night, under a blanket of stars more brilliant than any stained glass window, they cooked their meal together. Two lives, once shattered by cruelty, now mended by something fiercer than hate, something holier than any sermon. They had built their own world, their own faith, their own wild, beautiful love. And it was more than enough. It was everything. In the end, this is not just a story of survival, but a testament to the profound truth that true sanctuary is not a place on a map, but a presence in your soul. It teaches us that the deepest wounds are not healed by the hollow forgiveness of those who harmed us, but by the fierce, unwavering, and unconditional acceptance of those who see our true worth even when we cannot. Eliza and Toha, two disparate souls marked and scarred by the world's cruelty, discovered that love isn't about finding a perfect, unbroken person. It is about finding that one person whose scars sing a harmony with your own, and whose silence speaks the same language as your heart. They built a life not from the ashes of their painful pasts, but from the fertile ground of their shared strength and defiant love. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound and sacred acts of faith don't happen in a church with four walls, but in the untamed, open wilderness of the human heart, where we find the courage to choose our own salvation and build our own heaven. Thank you for joining us for another tale from the Untamed West. If this story moved you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others who love powerful stories, and subscribing to Wild West Stories for more true-hearted tales from the frontier.